Here's a photo I took, and I I was told that if you want a really beautiful still life painting, you need to start with a really good photo. So I've taken a bunch of photos, and that was one of my best ones. And I'm going to teach you some of my advice and tips, and go through my process of making a watercolor painting. First, I have drawn crosshairs on my on the print of my photo, and also drawn them on my paper and did a sketch. Now I'm setting out my paints and getting them ready. I like to tackle the background first. I'm tackling the background first because I like to work from back to front and from big to small. Those are like the first two rules to kind of keep in mind. You don't want to get caught up in the little details first. You're going to want to find like the simplest, biggest areas. Usually the background is going to take up a lot of space, and just fill in that section. The pears are also pretty large, and I was just kind of excited to get into them. And again, just kind of getting that color on there, avoiding kind of painting over the highlight because I want to keep that light, and also keeping things very light. With watercolor specifically, you want to go from light to dark. You don't want to like overload everything right away with dark colors that you're going to have to lift out later. It's best to just kind of get the lightest base colors on there, and then as the paint dries, to go over it again and again until it's the value or how light or dark you want it to be. Okay, so far we have big to small, back to front. Even though I didn't quite follow that one, that's just also keeping in mind like you are tackling kind of the biggest areas first, and getting the negative space, the area around the main thing, painted in, and then slowly getting into those smaller details. I fixed up the background. I just did that because it was too light, so I needed to darken it up some more. And now that I have kind of bigger areas starting to get painted in, now I am using the real light to dark. I got the light values in, and now I am refining those shadows, adding some shadow in there, adding that texture, looking at the color of the shadows on the pears, which are kind of a reddish, brownish look. And another thing kind of with light to dark is to go from thin paint, so like really watered down paint, to thicker paint. So in other words, if you're adding a lot of water to the watercolor, it'll turn out thinner, it'll turn out lighter. And then as you kind of start building up the color, building up the shadows, building up some textures, and you want to create some darker spots and more like refined edges and those shadows, then you're going to have to darken your paints some more. So moving on to like thicker paint or more pigmented paint on your brush with a lot of paint and just a little bit of water. Another important part of watercolor painting is to have some control over the wetness and dryness of the paint. If two kind of splotches of watercolor paint are wet and they touch each other, they're going to bleed into each other, and they're going to have some soft edges and some blooming, and it's just going to kind of bleed out, and it could dry into interesting patterns and textures after it kind of bleeds and all mixes in together. Whereas if you want cleaner edges, like clean, crisp edges, then you would want to wait for the paint to dry completely before you paint next to it. At the end of the video, I can take a few pictures really close up to the painting so I can show you the areas where I was able to maintain a clean edge versus some areas that have that kind of wet into wet texture. Now, after touching up the shadows around the linen and trying to just get it right, small areas by small areas, I think I'm done, or almost done. I accidentally went off of the tape there, so I'm just adding a little flourish of colors from my palette to just for fun. I just once over looking at the edges, I'm darkening up the shadow by the pear on the left because the edge just was kind of losing its shape. It was getting too soft, so, or like it was the same value as the background, so I am going over that again to define that edge some more. This is my finished product and I love how it turned out. I just recap on my painting roles. We went from big to small, back to front, light to dark, and thin to thick. Now these are what I have learned, what I've also kind of put together. And like I said, when we go to oil and acrylic paint, it'll be a little bit different. You're actually going to go from dark to light, so that's going to be the biggest difference there. So I like to show you some of the smaller details in the painting where we have that wet into wet technique versus the wet next to dry technique. And what you want to notice is that when the colors are seamlessly blending into each other, that was done with wet and wet, just kind of blend the shapes. If you look at the stem, you can kind of tell that there is some kind of bleeding out into the background. So I was impatient here and didn't make quite a clean edge, but you can kind of see that blending or that kind of leaking or blooming outward into the background. And then here's the edge in between the two pairs. I try to do a little bit better job there, making sure that the darker shadow there doesn't bleed into the highlight of the other pair. So I hope this gives you a good view of those soft versus hard edges, or those clean, maintained edges versus those bleeding edges.